They sent a lazy bride to shame the cowboy, but she built his ranch with bare hands. The wagon stopped at the edge of the property where the fence posts leaned like broken teeth. A woman stepped down, dress torn at the hem, hands too smooth for frontier work. Wade Langston watched from the porch, jaw tight. He had heard the stories. 3 towns back, they said she couldn't lift a bucket without stopping to rest. 2 saloons repeated the tale of how she let an entire household fall apart while she sat idle. The townsfolk had laughed when they told him Bonnie Halstead was coming. They called it a wedding gift. He called it a curse. But something about the way she looked at the ranch didn't match what they said. Her eyes moved across the broken roof, the sagging barn, the dry well. Not with fear, not with disgust. With something else entirely. Something that made Wade's certainty falter for just a moment before he pushed it down. Wade Langston had been alone on this land for 2 seasons, watching it die piece by piece. The drought had taken the creek. The wind had taken the barn door. Time had taken everything else. He needed help, real help, not some joke sent by people who wanted to watch him fail. When the town council told him a bride was coming, he expected someone capable, someone who understood that survival out here meant bleeding into the soil until something grew. Instead, they sent him Bonnie Halstead, the woman every settlement within riding distance whispered about. Lazy, useless, a burden. The wagon driver didn't even wait for payment. He turned the horses and left without a word, dust rising behind the wheels. Bonnie stood in the yard with a single canvas bag, the kind that held almost nothing. She didn't call out, didn't ask for help with her things. She just stood there, looking at the house like she was measuring it against something in her mind. Wade stepped off the porch, boots scraping against wood that needed replacing. The whole structure needed replacing. The roof leaked in 4 places. The walls had gaps wide enough to see daylight through. Winter would kill them both if nothing changed. He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough to see the dust on her dress, far enough to keep his doubt private. You Bonnie Halstead? His voice came out harder than he intended. She turned to face him. Up close he could see the calluses on her palms, hidden beneath the dust. Fresh ones like she had been gripping something rough for days. That didn't match the stories either. Her eyes were steady, not avoiding his, not challenging him. Just looking. I am. They say you can't work. They say a lot of things. Wade felt his jaw tighten. He didn't have time for riddles or pride. The ranch was failing, and he needed answers, not clever replies. Can you work or not? Bonnie glanced past him at the house, at the barn leaning so far to one side it looked ready to collapse with the next strong wind. She looked at the empty corral, the cracked water trough, the fence that barely stood. When her eyes came back to his, something had shifted in them, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, though he couldn't say why. Guess we'll find out. She picked up her bag and walked past him toward the house, her steps certain despite the uneven ground. Wade stood there, caught between anger and confusion. The woman who couldn't lift a bucket had just walked past him like she owned the place, like she knew something he didn't. He turned to follow her, but she was already at the door, already pushing it open, already inside. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting everything in shades of red and gold. Wade looked at the barn, at the work that needed doing, at the impossibility of it all. Then he looked at the house where Bonnie Halstead had disappeared. Tomorrow he would find out if the stories were true. Tomorrow he would see if this was the final joke before everything fell apart. But tonight, something bothered him. Something about those calluses on her hands. Something about the way she looked at the broken ranch like she was already fixing it in her mind. Wade woke before dawn, like he always did. The cold air bit through the thin walls of the house, and he could see his breath in the gray light. He dressed quickly, expecting to find Bonnie still asleep in the small room he had given her. Women from town always complained about the cold, about the hard beds, about everything that made frontier life what it was. He pulled on his boots and walked to the kitchen, ready to start the fire himself. But the stove was already warm. Embers glowed orange in the belly of it, and a pot of water sat heating on top. Wade stopped, hand still on the doorframe. He looked around the kitchen. The floor had been swept. The dishes from yesterday, which he had left in a pile, were clean and stacked on the shelf. The table had been wiped down. He walked to the window and looked out at the yard. Bonnie was already outside. She stood near the barn, examining the door that hung crooked on broken hinges. She wasn't just looking at it. She was running her hands along the frame, checking the wood, testing the weight of the door itself. Wade watched as she walked around to the side of the barn where he kept what was left of his tools. She picked up a hammer, weighed it in her hand, then set it down, and chose a heavier one instead. What was she doing? He grabbed his coat and went outside. The ground was hard with frost and his boots crunched across it. Bonnie didn't turn when he approached. She was measuring the barn door against the frame, her eyes moving in a way that suggested she was calculating something. "You know how to fix that?" Wade kept his voice flat, not wanting to sound impressed when he didn't even know what she was planning. Bonnie glanced at him, then back at the door. "Hinges are stripped. Frame is rotted on this side. Door's too heavy for what's holding it." She pointed to where the wood had split along the top hinge. "Needs new mounting points and a support beam across the top. Otherwise, it'll just fall again." Wade blinked. Those were not the words of someone who couldn't work. Those were the words of someone who had built things before, who understood structure and weight, and what held together under strain. "You know how to do that?" Bonnie set the hammer down and looked at him directly. "Your problem isn't the door. It's the whole frame. You fix the door without fixing the frame, and you're wasting time." She walked past him toward the house, not waiting for his response. "I'll need breakfast before I start. You have flour?" Wade stood there, caught between confusion and something that felt uncomfortably close to respect. He followed her back to the house, mind racing. The stories didn't match. None of this matched. A woman who couldn't lift a bucket didn't wake before dawn. She didn't sweep floors or clean dishes without being asked. She certainly didn't examine a barn like a builder looking at a job. Inside, Bonnie was already mixing flour and water in a bowl, her hands working with practiced efficiency. Wade sat at the table watching her. "Who taught you that? About the frame and the door?" She didn't look up from her work. "My father built houses. I helped him from the time I could hold a nail steady." Wade leaned back in his chair. "Then why do they say you can't work?" Bonnie's hands stopped moving. For a moment, the only sound was the fire crackling in the stove. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, but there was steel underneath it. "Because I said no to the wrong man, and he made sure everyone believed I was worthless." She went back to mixing the dough, her movements controlled and precise. Wade felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of injustice that he understood too well. He had been alone on this ranch because people believed things about him too. Stories that weren't true but spread anyway, like poison in water. The biscuits baked while the sun rose over the hills. Wade ate in silence, tasting food better than anything he had made in months. When Bonnie finished her own plate, she stood and walked to the door. She paused there, hand on the frame, and looked back at him. "The barn won't fix itself. You coming?" Wade pushed back from the table and followed her out into the cold morning air. Whatever she was, whoever she was, the stories had been wrong. And if they were wrong about her, maybe this ranch still had a chance. But as they walked toward the barn together, Wade couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. Something that would test more than just their ability to repair a door. By midday, Wade had stopped pretending to lead. Bonnie worked with a precision that made his own efforts look clumsy. She measured twice before cutting wood, marked the support beam placements with charcoal, and drove nails with strikes that didn't bend or miss. Wade held boards in place while she secured them, handed her tools when she asked, and tried not to stare at the way she moved through the work, like someone who had done it 1,000 times before. The barn door hung straight for the first time in a year. The frame held firm under Bonnie's repairs, reinforced with crossbeams that distributed the weight properly. Wade tested it, swinging the door open and closed, listening to the smooth movement where there had only been grinding and scraping before. He looked at Bonnie, who was already walking toward the water trough, examining the cracks that ran through the wood like spider webs. "This won't last another week." She knelt beside it, running her fingers along the split boards. "When did it start leaking?" 2 months ago. Wade joined her, crouching on the other side. "I patched it with tar, but it just keeps opening up." Bonnie shook her head. "Tar's temporary. Wood's too dry. It needs to be replaced, not patched." She stood and looked at the corral, at the fence posts that leaned at angles, at the rails that had fallen and never been put back. "How long has this place been falling apart?" Wade felt heat rise in his face. "Long enough." He stood as well, defensive now. "I've been doing what I can alone." "I know." Bonnie's voice wasn't accusing. She was still looking at the corral at the scope of work that needed doing. "But alone isn't enough for a place this size. You need help. Real help. That's why you're here." The words came out sharper than Wade intended. Bonnie turned to face him, and for the first time since she arrived, he saw something close to emotion cross her face. Anger, maybe. Or hurt. I'm here because they sent me as a joke. Because they wanted to watch you fail with a useless woman at your side. She stepped closer, voice low but firm. So yes, I'm here, and I'm working. But don't pretend you asked for me. Don't pretend you wanted this. Wade opened his mouth to respond, but thunder rolled across the sky, cutting him off. They both looked up. Dark clouds were gathering from the west, moving faster than seemed natural. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of rain. Bonnie's expression changed immediately, shifting from anger to something Wade recognized. Fear, not of the storm itself, but of what it would do to a ranch already broken. The roof. She was already running toward the house. Wade, the roof has 4 holes. If this storm hits hard, everything inside will be ruined. Wade ran after her, his mind racing through what they had inside. Blankets, food stores, the few tools he couldn't afford to replace. All of it would be destroyed if water poured through those holes unchecked. He reached the house as Bonnie was dragging a ladder from behind the barn, her face set with determination. You can't go up there. Wade grabbed the ladder. Not in this wind. Then help me, or get out of my way. Bonnie pulled the ladder from his grip with surprising strength. I didn't come here to watch another thing fall apart because someone was too afraid to act. The first raindrops hit, fat and cold. Thunder cracked overhead, and the wind gusted hard enough to make the ladder shake in Bonnie's hands. Wade looked at the roof, at the woman who refused to back down, at the storm bearing down on them with the kind of fury that could strip a roof clean off if they didn't move fast. He grabbed one end of the ladder. Together. We do this together or not at all. Bonnie nodded once and they moved. The ladder went up against the side of the house just as the rain began in earnest. Wade climbed first, with Bonnie right behind him, both of them carrying canvas and nails and rope. The wind tried to tear them off the roof, and the rain turned the shingles slick beneath their boots. But they worked, side by side, covering holes with canvas and securing it with anything that would hold. Below them, the storm raged. The ranch that had been dying piece by piece was now fighting for survival in a single night, and on the roof, soaked through and shaking from cold, Wade Langston realized that the woman everyone said was useless might be the only reason he had any chance at all. But as lightning split the sky and illuminated the land around them, Wade saw something that made his blood run cold. One of the fence posts near the road had a rope tied to it, and attached to that rope, barely visible through the rain, was a sign. The storm passed near midnight, leaving the land soaked and steaming in the sudden cold. Wade and Bonnie climbed down from the roof, canvas holding against the wind, water dripping from their clothes. Neither spoke as they walked toward the fence line where Wade had seen the sign. His boots sank into mud with each step, and beside him, Bonnie's breathing was steady despite the exhaustion that must have been pulling at her bones. The sign hung crooked on the post, rain-darkened wood with letters carved deep enough to read even in the dim light from the house. Wade stopped 3 paces away, jaw clenching as he read the words. Lazy bride for lazy land. Below it, smaller, crueler. Watch them both rot. Bonnie stood beside him, water still running down her face, chest rising and falling from the climb and the work. And now this. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Wade could feel the rage coming off her like heat. Controlled, but barely. He reached up and tore the sign down, wood splintering in his grip. The post underneath was fresh. Planted recently. Someone had come onto his land while they worked, while they fought to save the roof, and put this here for them to find. They want us to fail. Wade's voice was rough. They're watching. Bonnie took the broken sign from his hands, examining the letters in the faint light. These were carved today, wood still wet inside. She looked back toward the road, eyes narrowing. Whoever did this was here during the storm. They wanted us to see it right away. Wade felt something cold settle in his stomach. Someone had stood out here in the rain, watching them on the roof, planting this sign while they struggled to keep the house from flooding. The violation of it made his hands shake. Who would do that? Bonnie's face was unreadable. People who need us to be a joke. People who sent me here hoping we'd both give up. She dropped the sign into the mud and stepped on it, driving it down with her heel. They don't know who they're dealing with. Wade looked at her, really looked at her, soaked through, hair plastered to her face, hands still bleeding from where splinters had torn into her palms on the roof. She should have been broken by now, should have been crying or demanding to be taken back to town. Instead, she was standing in the mud, defiant, ready to keep fighting. Something in Wade's chest tightened, an emotion he didn't want to name yet. Inside, Wade gestured toward the house. You need to dry off before you catch something worse than splinters. Bonnie didn't move. Tomorrow, we fix the water trough. Day after we start on the corral. She looked at him, and in the darkness her eyes held something fierce. They think we'll quit. We're going to prove them wrong. Wade nodded slowly. Every fence post, every broken board. We fix it all. They walked back to the house together, leaving the broken sign behind in the mud. Inside, Wade built up the fire, while Bonnie changed into dry clothes in the back room. When she emerged, she moved to the stove without a word and began heating water for tea. Wade watched her work, methodical and calm, despite everything that had just happened. Most people would have fallen apart. Most people would have demanded explanations or comfort or rage. Bonnie just kept moving forward. She handed him a cup of tea and sat across from him at the table. The fire crackled between them, and outside, the night settled into an uneasy quiet. Wade wrapped his hands around the warm cup, feeling the heat seep into his cold fingers. How long have you been fighting this? Bonnie looked into her own cup. Since I was old enough to understand that some people measure worth by obedience instead of ability. Her voice was steady, but Wade heard the weight underneath it. My father taught me to build. My mother taught me to think. Both of them taught me never to bow to someone just because they demanded it. And that's what got you labeled as lazy. Wade understood now. Saw the whole ugly picture. You refused someone with power, and they made sure you paid for it. Bonnie met his eyes across the table. A man named Gerald Pritchard. He owns half the businesses in 3 towns. He wanted a wife who would smile and stay quiet and make him look good. When I said no, he made sure no one would hire me. Made sure everyone thought I was worthless. She took a sip of tea. Made sure that when I finally had to accept help, it would be from someone desperate enough not to care about the rumors. Someone like me. Wade set his cup down. They sent you here because they thought we'd both fail together. Bonnie smiled, but there was no humor in it. Yes, but they were wrong about something important. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark land. They thought we'd accept failure. They didn't count on us being too stubborn to quit. 3 days of work changed the ranch in ways Wade hadn't thought possible. The water trough stood rebuilt, sealed properly with new boards that didn't leak. The corral fence had been straightened, posts reset deep into the ground, rails secured with proper joinery instead of just nails and hope. Bonnie worked from dawn until her hands bled, then wrapped them and kept working. Wade found himself matching her pace, pushing harder than he had in months, maybe years. But on the 4th morning, Wade woke to find Bonnie already outside, staring at something near the barn. He dressed quickly and joined her, following her gaze to the ground. Tracks, boot prints that weren't theirs, circling the barn. Approaching the house, walking the fence line. Fresh tracks from sometime in the night while they slept. Someone was here. Bonnie's voice was flat, emotionless in a way that made Wade's skin crawl. They walked the entire property. She pointed to where the tracks went behind the barn, to the tool shed, back around to the front door of the house. They were checking everything, seeing what we've fixed. Wade crouched beside one of the prints, measuring it with his hand, bigger than his own boot. A man, heavy, confident enough to walk openly instead of trying to hide his path. He stood and looked at Bonnie. They're not just watching anymore, they're getting closer. Bonnie walked to the barn door, examining the latch. It's still locked. They didn't take anything or break anything. She turned back to Wade. They just wanted us to know they could, that they can come here whenever they want. Anger flared hot in Wade's chest. This was his land, his home. The fact that someone felt comfortable walking it in the dark, uninvited, circling like a predator, made every muscle in his body tense for a fight. We set a watch tonight. Take turns. If they come back, we'll be ready. Bonnie nodded, but her eyes were troubled. What happens when being ready isn't enough? What happens when they stop just watching and start acting? Wade didn't have an answer. He looked at the ranch, at everything they had repaired, at the progress that felt so fragile now. They want us to be afraid, want us to leave. Then we don't leave. Bonnie's jaw set in that determined line he was starting to recognize. We keep working. We keep fixing. We show them that we're not going anywhere. They spent the day reinforcing the barn door with a crossbar that could be dropped from inside, adding a similar bar to the house door, checking sight lines from the windows. Defensive preparations that made the whole situation feel more real, more dangerous. Wade caught himself watching the road more than the work, scanning the tree line, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Bonnie did the same, her movements still efficient, but her attention divided. When evening came, they ate in silence, both too aware of the darkness gathering outside. Wade checked the windows one more time, made sure the doors were barred, then looked at Bonnie across the table. "I'll take first watch. You should rest." Bonnie shook her head. "We both watch. If something happens, we need to be ready together, not scrambling to wake each other up." So they sat in the dark kitchen, fire banked low, watching through the windows as the night settled over the land. Hours passed. Nothing moved except the wind through the grass, the occasional shift of shadows under the moon. Wade felt his eyes getting heavy despite his determination to stay alert. Beside him, Bonnie remained perfectly still, focused on the yard like she could will threats away through sheer attention. Then, near midnight, they both saw it at the same time. A light, moving on the road. Small, like a lantern being carried but coming closer. Wade stood slowly, hand moving to the rifle he had leaned against the wall. Bonnie rose as well, her face pale but composed in the dim light. The lantern stopped at the edge of the property, right where the sign had been planted. They couldn't see who held it, just the light swaying slightly in the breeze. Then it moved again, this time toward the barn. Slow, deliberate, like whoever carried it wanted to be seen. Wade felt his heart hammering against his ribs. They were past watching now. This was something else entirely. The lantern stopped at the barn door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, in the silence, they heard it. The sound of liquid splashing against wood. The sharp, unmistakable smell of kerosene drifting on the wind. Wade grabbed the rifle and was out the door before Bonnie could stop him. The cold night air hit his face as he ran toward the barn, boots pounding against the ground. Behind him he heard Bonnie following, her steps quick and determined. The lantern light swung wildly as whoever held it turned at the sound of their approach. Wade could see the figure now, a man in dark clothes, bulky and tall, exactly matching the boot prints from that morning. The man dropped the lantern and ran. The glass shattered against the barn wall, flames spreading instantly across the kerosene-soaked wood. Wade skidded to a stop, torn between chasing the intruder and stopping the fire. Bonnie made the decision for both of them, sprinting past him toward the well. She grabbed the bucket and rope, dropping it down fast, hauling it up with speed born from pure adrenaline. Wade joined her, taking the full bucket and running to the barn, throwing water against the flames that were already climbing toward the roof. The fire fought back, fed by kerosene and dry wood and wind. Bonnie was already back with another bucket, then another, both of them moving in desperate rhythm. Draw water, run, throw, repeat. The heat singed Wade's face and hands, and smoke burned his lungs, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. This barn held what was left of his hay, his tools, everything he needed to survive the coming season. If it burned, the ranch was finished. Bonnie stumbled beside him, exhaustion making her movements clumsy. Wade caught her arm, steadying her. "Keep going. We're winning." And they were. Slowly, painfully, the flames started to die. The kerosene had only been splashed on one wall, not the whole structure. If the man had taken time to douse the entire barn, nothing could have saved it. But he had been rushed, sloppy, maybe spooked by something before Wade and Bonnie even emerged from the house. The fire shrank under their assault, steam rising where water met flame, until finally only smoking blackened wood remained. They collapsed against the well, both coughing, both soaked with sweat and water and ash. Wade looked at the barn. The damage was ugly but not fatal. One wall would need to be replaced entirely, and the fire had eaten through part of the roof, but the structure still stood. The hay inside was mostly untouched, protected by distance from where the flames had climbed. They had saved it. Barely, but they had saved it. Bonnie was shaking, not from cold, but from the aftermath of fear and exertion. Her hands were raw, blistered from the rope, and her face was streaked with soot. Wade reached out without thinking and wiped a smudge from her cheek. The gesture was gentle, intimate in a way that surprised them both. Bonnie looked up at him, eyes reflecting the dying embers from the barn, and for a moment neither of them moved. "You saved it." Wade's voice was rough. If you hadn't moved so fast, hadn't known exactly what to do, I'd be watching it all burn right now. Bonnie shook her head slightly. We saved it. Together. Wade felt something in his chest crack open. Something he had been holding tight for longer than he could remember. This woman, who everyone said was worthless, had just fought beside him like a partner, like someone who belonged here, like someone who cared about this place as much as he did. He wanted to say something, needed to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Then they heard it. Hoofbeats. Fast, and getting closer. Wade grabbed the rifle again, stepping in front of Bonnie instinctively. 3 riders came into view, torches held high, and as they got closer, Wade recognized the man in front. Gerald Pritchard. Tall, well-dressed even at this hour, with a face that radiated entitlement and cruelty in equal measure. Pritchard pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the yard, looking at the smoking barn, at Wade and Bonnie covered in ash and soot. His smile was cold and satisfied. Heard you might be having some trouble out here. Thought I'd come check, make sure everything was all right. Wade raised the rifle. Get off my land. Pritchard's smile widened. Your land. He looked around theatrically. Barely standing structures. Dying grass. And now a burned barn. This doesn't look like anyone's land. This looks like failure. He turned his attention to Bonnie. Miss Halstead, you look tired. Maybe it's time you admit you made a mistake coming here. I'm sure we could find you something more appropriate back in town. Bonnie stepped forward, placing herself beside Wade instead of behind him. I'm exactly where I choose to be. Pritchard's expression darkened. The 2 men flanking him shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their own weapons. The standoff held for 3 heartbeats. Wade's finger rested on the trigger, steady despite the exhaustion pulling at every muscle in his body. Pritchard sat perfectly still on his horse, torchlight casting shadows across his face that made him look almost demonic. The 2 men behind him waited for a signal, for permission to act. Bonnie stood beside Wade, unarmed but unflinching, her presence a statement in itself. Pritchard broke the silence first. You know, Langston, I heard stories about you too, before you came here, before you bought this worthless piece of land and tried to make something of it. He leaned forward in his saddle. They say you walked away from a partnership, left your own brother with debts you helped create. That's why you're out here alone, isn't it? Because no one back home would work with you after what you did. Wade felt ice spread through his veins. He had buried that past, left it behind when he rode west, hoped it would never follow him here. But of course it had. Stories always followed. Truth or lies or something twisted in between. They always found you eventually. I paid my debts. Wade's voice was low, dangerous. Every cent I owed, I paid. My brother made his own choices after I left. Pritchard shrugged. Maybe, but people remember the story they want to remember. Just like they remember that Miss Halstead here is lazy and useless. Just like they'll remember that your barn burned because you couldn't protect it. He gestured at the smoking structure. Stories have power. Langston, and right now the story is that you're both failures, that this ranch is cursed, that anyone who tries to make it work will lose everything. Bonnie's voice cut through the tension like a blade. We're still standing. The barn is still standing. Your man failed to burn us out. That's the real story. Pritchard's jaw tightened. Is it? Because from where I sit, you're both exhausted, broke, and one bad storm away from losing everything anyway. He straightened in his saddle. I'm a reasonable man. I'll make you both an offer. Langston, you sign over this land to me at a fair price. Not much, but enough to start somewhere else. Somewhere easier. And Miss Halstead, you come back to town under my protection. I'll make sure the stories about you change. Make sure people know you tried your best here, but it wasn't your fault it didn't work out. Wade felt Bonnie tense beside him. The offer was poison dressed as mercy, and they both knew it. Pritchard wanted the land, wanted Bonnie back under his control, wanted to prove that resistance was futile, that he always won in the end. And if we refuse? Wade kept the rifle steady, pointed at Pritchard's chest. Then the stories get worse. Pritchard's smile returned. Accidents happen. Fires start. People talk. Eventually, you'll have no choice but to leave, and when you do, you'll leave with nothing. No money, no reputation, nothing. He paused, letting the threat sink in. Or you can be smart. Take my offer. Walk away with something instead of nothing. Wade looked at the ranch, at the barn they had just saved. at the water trough and corral and fence posts they had repaired with blood and sweat and determination. At the home he had tried to build from nothing, the fresh start he had hoped would redeem the mistakes he had made before. Then he looked at Bonnie, at the woman who had fought beside him, who had proven every story about her wrong, who stood now facing down the man who had destroyed her reputation without showing an ounce of fear. She met his eyes, and in that moment, Wade saw his answer reflected back. They had both run from their pasts. Both been judged and condemned by stories that may or may not have been true. But here, on this dying ranch, they had found something worth fighting for. Not just land or buildings, but proof that they could be more than the stories others told about them. Wade lowered the rifle slowly, deliberately. Pritchard's smile widened, mistaking the gesture for surrender. Then Wade spoke, voice carrying across the dark yard with absolute certainty. "Get off my land. We're not leaving. We're not selling. And if you send another man to burn what we've built, I'll make sure the whole territory knows who's really behind it. Your name, your threats, everything." Pritchard's face went hard as stone. The men behind him shifted again, hands moving to weapons. But Pritchard raised a hand, stopping them. He stared at Wade and Bonnie for a long moment, anger and calculation warring in his expression. Then he turned his horse. "You'll regret this, both of you." His voice was cold, final. "When this ranch fails, and it will fail, don't come begging for help." He rode away, the two men following, torches disappearing into the darkness. Wade and Bonnie stood in the yard, listening to the hoofbeats fade, both knowing that something fundamental had just changed. They had drawn a line, made an enemy of someone powerful, and there would be consequences. 6 weeks after Pritchard rode away, 3 wagons arrived at the ranch unannounced. Wade was reinforcing the new barn wall when he saw them coming down the road, Bonnie beside him handing him nails with hands that had calloused over completely, scars from rope and splinters now permanent marks of the work they had done. They both stopped, watching the wagons approach with the wariness that had become second nature since the fire. But these weren't Pritchard's men. The first wagon held a family, husband and wife with 2 children. The second carried an older man and his grown son. The third had supplies, lumber and tools visible under canvas covers. They stopped at the edge of the property, and the first man climbed down, hat in hand, expression uncertain but determined. "Mr. Langston? Miss Halstead?" The man glanced between them. "My name is Thomas Brennan. We're from the settlement east of here. We heard what happened, heard about the fire, heard about Pritchard's threats." He paused, looking at the ranch, at the rebuilt fence, the repaired barn, the straight corral posts. "Heard that you refused to quit." Wade stepped forward slowly, confused. "What are you doing here?" Thomas Brennan looked back at the other wagons, then at Wade. "Pritchard's been doing this for years, buying up land from people he's bullied into selling, spreading lies about anyone who won't bend to him. Most of us were too afraid to say anything, too afraid to stand against him." He straightened his shoulders. "But you did, both of you. And we figured if you're brave enough to fight, maybe we're brave enough to help." The other men climbed down from their wagons. The older man spoke next, voice gravelly but firm. "Pritchard came to me last week, said he heard I was thinking of expanding my farm onto land he wants. Made threats, made it clear I should sell to him instead." His jaw tightened. "But then I heard you told him to leave. Heard you're still here working despite everything he tried. Figure that makes you the kind of neighbors worth having." Bonnie's eyes widened as understanding hit. "You came to help us build, not just build." Thomas gestured to the supplies in the third wagon. "We came to make sure this ranch stands. Make sure Pritchard knows he can't just burn people out or threaten them into giving up. We stand together, or we fall one at a time." Over the next 4 days, the ranch transformed. The burned barn wall was replaced with lumber the neighbors brought, stronger than what had been there before. The roof was completely redone, sealed tight against weather. The corral was expanded, fencing extended to hold twice as many animals. The house got a new porch, reinforced foundations, windows that actually closed properly. Wade and Bonnie worked alongside their new allies, exhaustion pushed aside by something more powerful than fear or determination. Hope. Real, tangible hope that they weren't alone anymore. On the morning of the 5th day, another rider came, but this time it was a young man from town carrying a letter. He handed it to Wade, tipped his hat nervously, and left without waiting for a response. Wade opened the letter, Bonnie reading over his shoulder. It was from the town council, brief and formal. Gerald Pritchard had been asked to leave the territory after multiple families came forward with complaints about threats and intimidation. An investigation had been opened into the fire at the Langston ranch. Pritchard had departed 3 days ago, heading east, unlikely to return. Wade read it twice, making sure he understood. Then he handed the letter to Thomas Brennan, who read it aloud to the assembled group. Cheers went up, quiet at first, then louder. Someone clapped Wade on the back. Someone else congratulated Bonnie. The celebration was brief, practical, but real. That evening, after the families had returned to their own homes, Wade and Bonnie stood on the new porch watching the sun set over land that finally felt like it might survive. The ranch wasn't perfect. There was still work to do, seasons to get through, challenges ahead. But the structures stood strong. The fences held. The barn was solid and dry. And most importantly, they had proven that the stories were lies. Both of them. Wade turned to Bonnie, seeing her clearly in the golden light. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth. Her dress was patched and worn from work, and her hands bore the permanent marks of building something real. She was the furthest thing from lazy he had ever seen. They were wrong about you. His voice was quiet but certain. Every single person who said you couldn't work, couldn't build, couldn't do this, they were all wrong. Bonnie smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. They were wrong about you too, about this place, about what was possible. She looked at the ranch, at everything they had created together. We built this, with bare hands and stubbornness and refusal to accept what other people decided we were. Wade felt something settle in his chest, a peace he hadn't known in years. Yes, we did. The sun dropped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The ranch stood solid in the gathering darkness, no longer dying, no longer broken. And on the porch, 2 people who had been sent as jokes, as failures, as examples of what not to be, stood together, having proven that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to fall. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and determination change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything.